Hi there. An American delegation was recently in Beijing to talk trade. The discussions were reported as being candid and efficient. However, the two sides' demands are still far apart. What are the stated desires of each side in the negotiations? Are these just opening positions for further negotiation? And is a trade war looking more likely, or will compromise be found? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Andy Mock, founder and managing director of Red Pagoda Resources, and Professor Paul Gillis of the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
2 days of China-U.S. trade talks ended in Beijing on Friday with no breakthroughs. The Trump administration is demanding dramatic concessions that challenge core elements of China's economic system. They include a $200 billion cut in the U.S. trade deficit with China by 2020. China said big differences remain as the high-level U.S. delegation headed home. Some of the biggest voices in U.S. economics warned that tariff-heavy approach to trade could drag the country to the disaster again. More than 1,100 economists, including Nobel Prize winners and former presidential advisors, signed a letter to President Donald Trump. They quote directly from another letter sent in 1930 against the protectionist measures at the start of what became the Great Depression.
A joint letter from the U.S. economists pointed out the essence and harm of the tariffs imposed on China by Washington. It once again proved that unilateralism and protectionism are no different to conducting a self-isolating siege. It does not comfort the rules of the market. It will do harm to not only others, but also the U.S.
But the two sides have reached consensus in some areas, including mutual understanding over the significance of fair trade to both countries and the rest of the world. China and the U.S. agreed to set up procedures to stay in close touch. The White House issued a statement saying that though the two sides remained far apart, the talks were constructive.
Gentlemen, what do you think of the outcome from this first round of negotiations between the two sides?
Well, given the respective positions that the two sides put out at the start, I think the outcome was about what you expected, which is they made, if anything, no progress. Probably at best maybe an agreement to have further discussions, but that's not really entirely clear because the U.S. side didn't even release an announcement.
And perhaps the American side has been informed of the Chinese position very clearly. They know the Chinese demands and positions, and it's up to President Trump to make the final decision. So do you think Trump will go ahead and impose punitive tariffs and exercise protectionist policies, or do you think there's some margin for compromise in the future?
Well, I think in any kind of high-stakes negotiation, either side compromises only when they feel they must. And I think in this situation, whether or not the Trump administration levies tariffs or other punitive measures against China, that they may win that battle, but I think that it's going to be difficult for them to prevail over China in the larger sense, meaning accomplish the goals that they set out to accomplish.
What do you think are the most devastating and dangerous challenges in the nail-biting negotiations that occurred a couple of days ago in Beijing? And I believe the second round will take place in the D.C. if it could happen. So what are the most difficult parts?
Well, I think you have to get to the root of what the dispute is really over. And it's, I think, less over the deficit, the trade deficit, which could be fixed in a number of different ways. It's more about the rising challenge that China faces to the U.S. economy. And that really comes over technology. And the role that China is now seeing more advanced technology, needs more advanced technology, and will be competing with the U.S. in sectors where U.S. didn't historically have to compete against China.
But the Chinese side feels it's too much to ask China stop completely subsidization for our advanced manufacturing, namely 2025 Made in China initiative. That's too much. It means push China back to the zero starting point. That's non-negotiable from the Chinese perspective. So what do you think of the future?
Well, I think it absolutely is not negotiable from the Chinese perspective, but to broaden even what Paul was saying, that I think it's not about trade, and like married couples, sometimes they argue about a seemingly trivial issue, but it actually is emblematic of a much deeper problem. I think that the U.S. today sees China not just as an economic threat, but an existential threat, in that if your worldview all along was the world was flat, and suddenly Galileo comes along and says, wait a minute, your whole worldview is at best incomplete. That's incredibly threatening. So I think that what needs to happen is the U.S. needs to recalibrate and have a new worldview that incorporates the rise of China in every sense, not just economically, but technologically, culturally, and politically as well.
Perhaps that would be a mission impossible for at least the Trump administration, which is surrounded by so many ex-generals and super hawks like John Bolton and Navarro. So, again, any silver lining for whatever compromise, given the very difficult position on both sides?
You know, if people were looking for a face
because what Andy said was you got to give China some recognition for a rising power. You just cannot deprive it of its opportunities and the rights to enjoy the status of digital technology.
Yeah, I think it's difficult at this stage to reach that kind of face-saving compromise because the positions that were set forth by the U.S. were so strong. And that it seems hard to imagine how the Trump administration could back down enough to be able to reach an agreement. On the Chinese side, I don't think those demands were probably intended quite as strong. You know, the Chinese demands to reduce the restrictions on high technology products that might have military uses from being exported to China. I think China understands that, and that's less of an issue than the U.S. view that China should basically abandon state support for emerging technologies.
You guys know the political will and the strongman politics in China today. What the United States asks for is actually to China surrender unconditionally, and that's pretty out of the question. I mean, it's ridiculous.
When the U.S. was criticized for a long time for not being specific about what it actually wanted China to do, and you'd hear often people complaining in China, what do they want? And they couldn't articulate it. Well, they finally got the list, and the list was very detailed. When I first looked at that list, my reaction was the only way that China would sign this is on the deck of a battleship.
Well, let me jump in here. And while that sounds very negative, I think that there is room for optimism here, because we would also need to recognize that Trump's background as a real estate developer, as a savvy and tough business negotiator, that it's very common, especially in the New York real estate world, to make very extreme demands, but then actually do a complete 180 and capitulate. Because Trump, I think, at the core is not an ideologue. So he would not say we cannot compromise on this because of principle, but I think if he recognizes that he has a losing hand, then he will do, BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, right? So he'll take what's the second best on offer. So I think that, again, because this is a high-stakes head-to-head negotiation, that no one willingly cedes ground, but they only step back when they have to and when they recognize the realities.
We understand the platform on which President Trump rose to the presidency. However, like a columnist of the United States said recently in an article that a trade war could be won on condition that you could align your partners and allies behind you. But Trump is known for putting America first, alienating partners, antagonizing competitors. I mean, none of the partners or allies said clearly, we will unconditionally take side with you in your war against China. None of them said so clearly. Perhaps not yet. But what do you think of, the strategy by the Trump administration?
Well, I think his strategy was that he felt he had his base behind him because they had seen their jobs domestically. And that's all he's really concerned about. He's not concerned about the rest of the world. Now, I think one of the demands that the U.S. made in its manifesto gives you some hint for a possible compromise. And that was the demand that said that China would stop targeting agricultural products. Because in the first round of trade sanctions that Trump proposed, China responded by going after soybeans and sorghum, two products that come out of the Trump base in the heartland of America. And the fact that they've shown that that is something they want removed indicates to me that it wouldn't have been necessary if China agreed to everything else, that it not target the soybeans. That it's really that this is what what Trump really wants is to make sure that China does not separate him from his base.
Well, you keep your eyes on the prospect of the midterm elections. However, some Chinese analysts have pointed out he may lose traditional supporters in agriculture sector, but he will gain votes from another area, for example, areas of steel and aluminum, where punitive tariffs will soon be imposed. He's going to gain and garner support from this particular area to keep the balance of the power base. What do you think?
Well, I think you know, the ground game in the midterm elections is a fascinating subject. But let me go back to your earlier point, Yang Roy, about the international coalition that the U.S. might or might not be able to form. I think that when we look at, say, the AIIB, the formation of the AIIB, and who was the first country to join?
America's closest
ally. Yes, right. And I think that in the past, because the U.S. was able to offer the largest market, security guarantees, as well as other inducements, that was really the core of this alliance. And now we look at a very viable alternative. China can also offer a large market. It can offer other benefits as well. So I think that that will make it, the international environment, I think, has shifted dramatically. So that makes it less likely, I think, that the U.S., whether if it re-enters TPP or through some other mechanism to try to build a coalition, will find it a very, very much more challenging environment.
When we look at the issue of a coalition of the willing and the role that the United Kingdom might play, we go back to what happened when David Cameron was the Prime Minister. He said during President Xi's visit to London that his country, which faces the issue of a Brexit, he said our country could play the role of a bridge between the United States and China. Let's start a golden era for the bilateral relationship. Do you think the UK would live up to that expectation?
Well, I think the UK may be willing to say it'll take that position. I'm not sure it could actually do anything. The real problem here is, I think, really directly between the United States and China, and I don't see how a third party can step in to really fix that.
And what do you think of the cut of $200 billion in 2 years to balance the trade? And that's one of the demands put forward by the U.S. delegation.
Well, I think this goes back, I think, to the question of first the U.S. intentions and then its strategy and tactics. Because this is really, I think, logically impossible. So on the one hand, you want to reduce the deficit, but you then also want to reduce the types of goods that you want to sell to China, say in the high-tech sphere or other sectors. So it seems like, in a way, that, you know, to do anything well, I think you have to be focused and pick one goal. And in a way, I think the U.S. is trying to have it all and ought to be able to recognize that, you know, you can't have everything, and to not offer a very clear path forward, but offer a contradictory set of terms, I think makes it impossible to reach any kind of agreement.
A question for both of you. It's a tricky issue and intractable problem, isn't it, for American and European partners to understand the roadmap that China followed since our entry into the WTO. They said, China took a very different way, and that really went beyond the understanding of Americans. They have no idea about the industrial policies by the Chinese side. They accuse the Chinese government of manipulating the economy by, providing SOE with the preferential policies at the cost of the non-public sector. They may not be true, but what do you think of the American concerns?
Well, the Americans in the WTO negotiations focused on two things. One, reducing tariffs so that American goods could come to China and be bought by the Chinese who were facing rising prosperity. And that worked. Trade has certainly gone up in that respect. What I think they also focused on was opening up the market for American investment in China, and that has backfired big time compared to.
But this time around, from my sources of information, I learned that China is ready to open up the financial services, the capital account, but the Americans seem to be insatiable.
Well, the problem is that opening up the market to China actually is what led to the loss of so many American jobs. Is that when you allow American companies to set up factories in China and then sell the goods back to the U.S., that's the problem. That's why the jobs left the heartland, and that's why the trade deficit grew to where it was. Apple phones are made in China, and that's a big part of the trade deficit.
Thank you so much. You're watching Dialogue with Andy Mock and Paul Gillis. We're discussing what would happen next after the U.S. trade delegation went home to discuss with their president the top positions of the Chinese side. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, gentlemen. So let's take a second look at the WTO issue. Andy, what are your thoughts on the way China subsidized allegedly its industries, and particularly our hefty investment in the high-tech area?
Well, I think one of the profound challenges, I think, in U.S.-China relations and more broadly, this Western consensus versus the Chinese model of development is, I think, in the West, many have allowed this idea of market capitalism to become a kind of a blind religion. And when you look at the way the Chinese economy has been described, the problems of corruption, unbalanced development, overinvestment in infrastructure, and yet there have been decades of 10+% GDP growth, and even in this new era where growth is between, 6.5% to 7%, which is almost triple the United States GDP growth rate, that there is now, I think, a more rational view saying that, wait a minute, maybe the way China is doing these things, while it violates some of our articles of faith, actually has some basis in reality. And this is where I'm hopeful that when we see comments by Secretary Ross, I think even the USTR said this as well, that, hey, China has a different system, and it seems to work for them, which is very different when we looked at 5-10 years ago. This system is wrong, it cannot continue, it's going to implode. So hopefully this more grounded sense of realism, and I use this analogy that the U.S. has been used to thinking the world is flat, and now suddenly someone comes along, challenges their worldview. It's very threatening. But hopefully they can process this emotional trauma and come to a point and recognize that, hey, there is a country that is as big, actually will be bigger, perhaps more technologically advanced than us, and we can accept that, and we can live in peace that way, versus saying, if anyone threatens us, we have to take measures to stop them.
Andy was talking about the alternative truth, wasn't he? And we could also go back to the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt in the last 30s. So what do you think of the role the government plays as an economist?
Well, I can look in history at a different event, and that would be in the early 1960s when the United States faced a technologically rising nation that looked like it was going to own space ahead of the United States. And the response that President Kennedy had in 1963 was to commit the United States to putting a man on the moon and bringing him safely back to Earth within 10 years. And that inspired investment in technology and breakthroughs in technology that we benefit from today.
And the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, put forward by the Reagan administration at the height of the Cold War, helped drain the Soviet Union. You won the Cold War against the so-called evil empire due to the enormous input into the high technology segment. What do you think of the role China plays? We're talking about the government, the visible hand.
Well, I think that that certainly makes a lot of sense. I mean, as Paul said, with the U.S.'s Sputnik moment, that essentially was a mass movement mobilizing the government, the military part of government, the non-military part of government, educational institutions, media, all to align and rally towards a single goal. So I think whether we're looking at a pluralistic, democratic, market-centered driven society or a more state-oriented one like China, I mean, these all make sense. I think if we look at some of these other issues of the USSR versus the US, and one interpretation, of course, is that the US forced the Soviet Union into an escalation where they could not last. So because the US had a larger economy and could outspend the USSR, driving it to collapse. I'm not sure it's that simple, but that is a dynamic I think that's definitely
Paul, you stayed in this host country for a number of years, and I believe you are proud of your expertise in learning more about China. This year witnesses the 40th anniversary of China's opening up, and the 1992 southern tour by Deng Xiaoping after Tiananmen was very impressive for at least one thing. He was talking about the public debates on whether we practice socialism or capitalism. He said, in the capitalist society you have some planning, but in the socialist society you have market forces that plays a due role. Guys in the White House failed to do their homework about the direction China took at the defining moment with the end of the Cold War. Deng Xiaoping played a decisive role in adopting a practical line of economic development. So this debate about market or planning is over in China, it seems. And yet it was picked by the American policy planners. So I don't know which side is on the right side of history.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can resolve which side is the right side of history. I mean, quite clearly the U.S. argues that the Chinese government has a role in helping to pick the winners. And that has not been a view of the American role of government. And so that's inherently at conflict. And so the U.S. wants China to stop supporting its industries to make them global leaders because they think that's unfair competition. Now, the U.S. could do the same thing. It could support its leaders and say, we are going to own advanced robotics. We're not going to let China have that leadership. But that's more difficult at present in the American system, although it clearly was done before when the Americans won the space race.
Some of the Americans and expats in Beijing said, well, the punishment against the ZTE proves counterproductive in terms of more investment from the Chinese government into the digital technology, and particularly governments at local level vow to prioritize their agenda in terms of the digital leadership. So what do you think of the consequences for the American side? Do you think our pursuit of digital leadership will be stopped effectively?
I think it's going to be difficult to be stopped. I mean, and I think first if we look at it at a tactical level, that on the one hand, the Trump administration is very focused on job creation in the United States. Mm-hmm. So if they do follow through with this ban, it will hurt companies like Qualcomm, quite likely lead to some job losses at least. So that there will be a kind of policy paralysis because they want one thing, it will have very severe negative impacts on other things that they want as much, if not more. So I think that's going to make it very difficult. At a more strategic level, while the U.S. had its Sputnik moment in the 60s, I think that this is also a kind of Sputnik moment for the U.S. in that all along, for China, in that I think everyone here has recognized at all levels of government, all levels of industry, the dependence that China has on foreign technologies, especially in the semiconductor area.
What are the basic points of view of American multinationals here in Beijing about the issue of a joint venture? Are they going to go back due to the tax reform and other preferential policies?
Well, I've seen a few companies that have said that they're taking a position in opposition to what the Trump administration is saying. Is they're saying they're in joint ventures because they want to be in joint ventures, not necessarily because they were required to be in joint ventures. That they see advantages to doing business jointly with someone who really knows the turf in China, some of the auto companies have said that even if the rules are opened up to allow them to have full control of their operations in China, they are not interested in doing that because they see benefits in participating in that. Others will take advantage of the ability to do things on their own, much as many companies did when wholly foreign-owned enterprises were first allowed in China some 20 years ago.
What do you think will happen to Apple? If they decide to relocate their R&D quarters from China to Vietnam and other low-income economies on our periphery, do you think China is likely to deprive Apple of all the market shares? Because China is fast becoming the biggest market for smartphones.
Well, I think already is the biggest market for smartphones, and I think like any country or any geographical political entity, whether it's a city, a state, or a country, everyone wants to attract the best companies to build the tax base, to have the high-value jobs, and will certainly use the various tools at its disposal, whether they're incentives, subsidies, or taxes on imports. And of course, this is all constrained by the legal system, extranational entities like WTO. So I think the one way to look at that is, of course, I think China will do what it can to keep the jobs and the businesses it sees as vital to its future here. The question, though, is are countries like the Vietnams or maybe the Malaysias able to compete with China in terms of the talent pool? At the manufacturing side, I think certainly. The higher-end R&D, some definitely, but at the scale that China, I think, is producing both talent as well as the R&D infrastructure here, I think aside from the U.S., it's hard to see, and the U.K., of course, a leader in AI, it's hard to see other countries having the scale and the depth of the R&D infrastructure that a place like China offers.
People in India speak very good English, but they don't have a very good infrastructure, all the conditions and skills necessary for the assembly line of a smartphone. But do you think China will, as part of its goodwill gesture to Prime Minister Modi in Qingdao next month, export the overcapacity and sustain the dynamics of the emerging markets?
Well, I do think that India will rise in large part as an alternative to China, and partly because it's a rising economy that creates many of the same opportunities that China did 20 or 30 years ago. Every multinational is reevaluating its supply chain. They've all relied very heavily on China. And now there's a lot of risk in doing that because of these potential trade wars and other issues. So they're going to try to diversify that, to try to find other alternatives, but it's going to be painful. In the 30 years that China has established itself as the manufacturing center of the world, it has the advantages. It has the logistics. It has the suppliers. It has the infrastructure that supports manufacturing. And that's going to have to be rebuilt somewhere else.
And I would say that it's not an either-or proposition, because on the one hand, the development of the tertiary economy in China, I think, requires that the Chinese and businesses invest in places like India and Africa, from everything from low-end manufacturing to R&D, to create this layer of financial securities and other types of services and products that a modern tertiary economy requires. And I think China is a big enough, diverse enough country that it can do both of these things at the same time.
That's indeed the higher stage of industrialization for China, which must upgrade its traditional low value added chain. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.